What is up, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today's reaction video is going to be what caused America's first nuclear meltdown. I didn't even know they had a first, never mind potentially a second, a third. I don't know what kind of scale this is on, but the fact that it's got a 25-minute video on it with over 1 million views, it's got to be some kind of large event which I personally never heard about. Again, when I think of a nuclear, meltdown, I'm not the most experienced in it. I'll be completely honest with that. I know nuclear is super dangerous, and it just makes me think of like Chernobyl. I think like on that scale. Now, I know for a fact this isn't on that scale. I definitely would have heard of it, like I've heard of obviously Chernobyl in the Soviet Union. Mental story, and I definitely do need to do more research on that because I only kind of know the premise of it, but I've heard of it. America's first nuclear meltdown? Never heard of it. Now, this was suggested by Arctic on Discord. If you guys want to get your suggestions noticed even more, join the Discord and put them in there. Like Arctic said, he's posting them on YouTube videos and in the Discord. And if you guys want to do that, the link will be in the description. If you want to see this content more often, let me know in the comments. I'd really appreciate that because, again, I haven't really done anything similar to this. I imagine it's 25 minutes. I don't know really what to imagine, but it's something different at least. So let me know if you want to see this kind of content in the future as well. And let's get straight into it. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you're new around here, like, why not? Just hit it. I'd seriously appreciate it. And now let's see what caused America's first nuclear meltdown.
Previously gathered evidence indicated
1962, okay.
that on the night of the accident, the three-man crew was in the process of connecting the control blades to the drive mechanism when the excursion occurred.
The excursion in question was a steam explosion that occurred near Idaho Falls, Idaho on January 3rd, 1961. The SL-1, or Stationary Low Power Reactor No. 1, an experimental nuclear power reactor developed by the United States Army, had destroyed itself in milliseconds.
Oh, wow.
Investigators said it was human error. The Army said it was the messy result of a sordid love triangle. Conspiracy theorists said it was a murder-suicide. There is still some controversy about what happened that night to this day, but what is absolutely clear is that the reactor's only 3 operators had died with no warning and no witnesses, and it was someone's fault.
Okay, so it sounds like only 3 people was hurt, which one is a good thing that more people wasn't, and that's obviously probably why I haven't heard of it. It's not a mass tragedy, but it is a tragedy in its own right. The 3 people lost their lives, and that's absolutely awful. Experimental, what do you expect? I think potentially can easily go wrong with this stuff. So it's it's a dangerous substance. Even to this day, it's still dangerous. Like, think bad potentially could happen. And back then, less technology, I guess, less idea about it. A disaster, I guess, was waiting to happen, especially when it was experimental. But this could have been a lot of different reasons, and people have got different ideas about it. So yeah, let's delve into this video. It could be an interesting one.
This is the true story of America's first nuclear meltdown.
The true story, okay. Well, what did I say? This is a 6th video in a series, Half-Life Histories. Okay, well, maybe we'll check out the others. There's at least another 5 before this. If you want me to check it out, let me know.
The SL-1 reactor and the buildings that housed it were located at the National Reactor Testing Station, approximately 40 miles west of Idaho Falls, Idaho.
Okay.
Part of the Army nuclear power program, SL-1 was designed and prototyped on-site from 1957 to 1958 and became operational that December. Its goal was to prove that miniaturized nuclear reactors were viable for Army operations, able to provide electrical and heating power to remote locations like the Arctic. But SL-1 was just...
I kind of like that idea. That would be a pretty genius. I don't know if it is like that to this day. Again, my knowledge is very lacking on it. But I get the process of it. You kind of, not unlimited source, but one which is going to thousands of years. Obviously, we've seen the aircraft carriers, which are nuclear powered. It can just keep going. In somewhere like the Arctic, you only have to restock it however many thousands and thousands of years it is. Makes sense. It does make sense.
One reactor in the U.S. military's ambitious plan to harness nuclear power in all its forms. In the August of 1958, a U.S. Navy reactor developed at the testing station became the beating heart of the world's first nuclear submarine,
okay,
the USS Nautilus, which used a relatively inexhaustible energy source to dive underneath the North Pole, putting all of the world's militaries on high alert. At the other end of the sprawling Idaho station, the U.S. Air Force was rerouting hundreds of millions of dollars towards a nuclear-powered jet aircraft that could stay aloft more or less forever.
We did a reaction on that. Bad idea. It never came to fruition. It was a bad
Tiny
idea.
SL-1 reactor, by contrast, the smallest in development, was not nearly as flashy and didn't get the attention or the funding that the promise of a nuclear jet or nuclear submarine commanded.
Makes sense.
What it did get, on the night of January 3, 1961, was the maintenance efforts of 3 young men, Army specialists Richard McKinley and John Burns, and Navy electrician first class Richard Legg. None of them were above 30 years old.
Oh man, that's
John
sad.
Burns was just 22. Trouble was already brewing years before the accident. John Burns and Richard Legg hated each other. They had gotten into drunken fistfights at prostitute-filled parties, and Legg had problems with authority. He had been caught sleeping in his car while on duty, he kicked his feet up on instrument panels, and he would set off alarms intentionally just to startle his crewmates.
I mean, if you wanted someone to work on a nuclear reactor, something super powerful, super dangerous, you've got to surely, like, proper vet someone. Again, I know this is a long time ago, and maybe the protocols were a bit different. But still, you've got to vet someone, like, it sounds like a disaster waiting to happen,
A
man.
month before the explosion, Legg showed up to work drunk.
Like,
In the
come
January
on,
of 1961,
on a
it was
nuclear
Richard
reactor.
McKinley's 3rd week on the job, and he was still learning the ropes, uncomfortable with all the readings and instruments.
Okay.
These were the men tasked with restarting a cold nuclear reactor containing 14 kilograms of uranium-235 on a frigid Idaho evening.
That's mental, man.
Shut down for Christmas and New Year's, SL-1 was to be brought back to life by Burns, Legg, and McKinley on the 3rd day of 1961.
Okay.
The most important part of this process was lifting the central control rod manually just 4 inches to reconnect it to its drive mechanism. Burns, Legg's subordinate that night, prepared to lift the more than 80-pound rod with his bare hands
80 pound,
while
wow.
Legg stood with him at the top of the reactor.
80 pound, that sounds like a lot, but I'm thinking in my head, it does sound like a lot, but we've got to do this conversion. 80 pound. Alright. 36 kg, it's not as bad, but with your bare hands. For someone like me, I definitely would struggle with that. I mean, can you see that? I ain't got much muscle at all. People call me chicken arms at times. I'm only messing, by the way. But yeah, so for me, I'd probably struggle like with something so dangerous to do that with my bare hands. Yes, I'd be able to do it, but you know, it'd be a bit of a sweat. Depends how big you are, I guess, but quite heavy.
McKinley paced nearby. At 9:01 p.m., a reactor that was rated for 200 kilowatts of power generation spiked to 100,000 times that amount,
Wow.
20 gigawatts, in just 4 milliseconds.
What?
The men didn't know it, but this minuscule moment, much faster than the blink of an eye, was the rest of their lives.
Oh, man.
Nuclear physics is hard, but how nuclear physics creates vast amounts of electricity is easy. Nuclear material naturally emits particles as it decays, which can impact other material and impart a tiny amount of energy as heat.
Okay.
If you put a bunch of nuclear material close together on purpose, as is the case in a nuclear reactor, radioactive decay will heat up other radioactive material, causing it to heat up and shoot out even more particles. Now
Makes
we
sense.
have a
On a very simple basic,
critical
I guess.
mass that will undergo a chain reaction all by itself. What stops this runaway reaction is other materials that get in the way, absorbing those particles. By moving these so-called control rods up and down in a nuclear reactor, you can precisely control how much heat is produced. Reactors then use this heat to turn water into steam and steam into electricity. If anything were to go really wrong at a nuclear power plant, control rods would probably be involved.
I imagine what the control rods, like, there been an error in them. They haven't come down. The heat's got too much. Something's gone disastrously wrong. That's pretty cool, though. Again, a very brief overlook on how one works, but it's awesome learning about this stuff in a video like this, which is obviously a tragedy, and you've got to focus on that as well, but I am learning as well, which is pretty cool.
The SL-1 nuclear reactor used water in 2 ways: as something to turn into steam, and as a fluid to slow down the neutrons, the particles that start and continue nuclear chain reactions, flying out from the fuel rods. You see, not every neutron has the right energy to continue a chain reaction. faster neutrons are actually worse than slower neutrons inside of a reactor. And so water, a very dense fluid, can act as a so-called moderator to help continue the heat production by slowing down particles. What's more, the water in a reactor like SL1 can act like a failsafe. If too much heat is generated, water molecules move apart and expand into steam inside of the reactor. Now there are voids and less water to moderate, too many fast neutrons are flying around, and the number of fissions decrease drastically. The reactor gets cooler and safer on the path towards shutdown. In the interest of simplicity and reducing size, SL1 only had 5 control rods. As a comparison, the Chernobyl reactor number 4 had 211.
Wow, what a difference. Again, I know we were looking at a small scale, that just sums it up. That is a massive difference. Like, what? You're talking like 2% pretty much.
Because of the small number of control rods and their orientation inside of SL1, the center control rod was immensely powerful. Moving it could drastically change the amount of radioactivity in the vessel. Shove the central rod number 9 all the way to the bottom of the reactor, and it would shut any reaction down. And pull it all the way up, and it could start up the reactor all by itself.
Oh, wow.
Make no mistake, building a prototype reactor like this was inherently less safe than other larger reactors. Most of these larger reactors followed a design protocol that held that no single control rod should be this powerful, should be able to shut down or start up a reactor all by itself.
It's common sense, isn't it, though? Like, why are you putting all your eggs in one basket? Spread it out. If one fails, there's a high chance nothing's going to go wrong because it's spread out. Like, that's just waiting
As it would
for a
take just
disaster.
one stuck rod to create a deadly situation.
Exactly.
As fate would have it, the control rods inside of SL1 had a habit of getting stuck. Between February of 1959 and December of 1960, the 5 control rods malfunctioned a total of 63 separate times.
What?
The central control rod had
That's a
malfunctioned
lot,
7 times. In response, the Army told its operators to exercise the rods, regularly move them up and down to prevent them from sticking in the future. But the rods weren't the only problem. All the way up until 1961, corrosion inside SL1 was building up, bearings were wearing down, rods were getting misaligned. 15 days before the accident, 2 of the rods inside of SL1 had to be hit with pipe wrenches in order to work them loose.
What?
On the night of January 3rd, John Burns was leaning over a demonstrably unreliable control rod number 9, preparing to lift it just a few inches as a part of routine maintenance. Richard Legg was watching over his shoulder. Richard McKinley was standing just a few feet away. At least, this was where their corpses suggested they were.
Oh, man.
The difference between a nuclear reactor and a nuclear bomb can be as simple as the speed of neutrons. When a large nucleus gets cleaved in two during a fission event, there are 2 kinds of neutrons that fly out. The first are so-called prompt neutrons, which are the particles that are launched outwards in less than 100 trillionth of a second. The second kind of neutrons are the delayed neutrons, which are produced by fission products a few fractions of a second later.
You know, they're delayed, but they're still coming out a few fractions of a second later, like, which is still absolutely mental.
Nuclear reactors take advantage of delayed neutrons in order to control the energy released. Nuclear weapons, on the other hand, want to produce as many prompt neutrons as possible, creating an avalanche of additional fissions that release energy as quickly as possible.
Makes sense.
When a reaction like this kicks off, it's unsurprisingly called going prompt critical, and it's a condition that would be an absolute disaster inside of a sealed reactor. Water and nuclear material would instantly vaporize, circumventing the natural failsafe of a water-moderated vessel, and create a situation closer to a nuclear bomb than to a source of electricity. At 7 p.m., John Burns got a phone call. It was his wife, Arlene, calling the SL1 facility to ask John for a divorce. According to Todd Tucker in his book on the subject, Atomic America, John and Arlene's last conversation ended with a discussion of how to split his paycheck. John would hang up the phone, exhausted, having slept on a friend's couch the last 2 nights. And because of his frequent headbutting with the powers that be at the National Reactor Testing Station, he was now personally and professionally stuck with the unglamorous, unloved SL1 reactor. This was all going on simultaneously in the mind of a man who at 9 p.m. that night finally reached the point in his long list of duties that involved moving the central control rod of SL1.
I mean, again, it just shows how a build-up of so many things can cause a disaster. Now, again, it may explain if this would have happened, if it was, it may have still happened if he was in a state of mind, in a good state of mind. I don't know if we'll ever know, he may explain it. But it's kind of like, again, you've talked about three people working together on something highly dangerous, don't like each other, or at least two of them don't, they've had fights. One turns up drunk, one's very irresponsible, doesn't always show up. Not a great leader, it sounds like. The other person, very very new to it, unexperienced, hasn't really done it, looking for leadership from the two people. One of them getting a divorce, literally 2 hours before, had a phone call about splitting the paycheck because of getting a divorce. It's just like, oh, like, the scenario could have been much worse in terms of the three people you've picked to be working on this potentially deadly thing, which was deadly. Mental,
With
man.
his supervisor, Leg, literally breathing down his neck and a soon-to-be over marriage surely clouding his mind, Burns hunched over the almost 100-pound rod, a rod that often got stuck, a rod that could start the reactor all by itself if handled improperly, and prepared to move it just 4 inches upward and no further. Operators of SL-1 knew what would happen if you lost focus and pulled the central control rod up too far. According to Susan M. Stacy in Proving the Principle, when asked whether or not the operators knew the reactor would go prompt critical if the central control rod were fully removed, one responded, quote, "Of course. We often talked about what we would do if we were at a radar station and the Russians came. We'd yank it out."
Oh, wow.
End quote. In other words, improperly removing the central control rod would immediately kill everyone in the building. Just 60 seconds later, at 9:01 p.m., this is exactly what happened. As the report completed years later would conclude, Burns withdrew the central control rod many inches too far, and just 4 milliseconds later, a power surge of 10 million% above normal operation explosively vaporized the core of SL-1.
Oh my god, I can see where the kind of theories of a suicide mission and stuff like that, or suicide attempt, comes from. He's basically in the pits in his life, he's the one who's had to do it, and like he described, he's pulled it out way too far. They do this on the regular, yes, it's super dangerous, and I wonder if there was an actual gauge of a measurement, makes it easier not to tell, because if it's just feel, I can understand how you could potentially get it wrong, but I can see where them kind of claims have come from.
Cooling water was blasted upwards by this vaporized fuel and struck the top of the vessel with an extreme amount of momentum, enough to lift the entire 26,000-pound apparatus over 9 feet into the air.
Wow. 12,000 kg. It actually gave me kg on my screen that time. I don't know if it did previously, but I didn't see it. But oh my god, man.
The plugs at the top of the reactor were forced open by the over 500 pounds per square inch of pressure, and the control rods were fired, like missiles, at the ceiling.
Wow.
The entire reactor room was instantly filled with burning steam, contaminated water, and fragments of the radioactive core. SL-1 had just gone prompt critical. Later experiments would show that the explosion that night was the equivalent of 32 kilograms of TNT. And all that energy was released directly into the bodies of Legg, McKinley, and Burns.
That's awful.
There was no one else in the building.
Absolutely mental.
Long,
Like, what?
short. This was the sequence of alarm bells that told the firefighters 8 miles away that something at the SL-1 site was wrong. Heat sensors had been tripped above the reactor. But the 6-person team on the way wasn't particularly worried. They had already responded to not 1, but 2 false alarms at the site earlier that same day. So when they got to the building's unguarded gate at 9:10 p.m., they were expecting another non-incident. What they were not...
Again, that's 2 in one day. I haven't really mentioned if they've done it a lot on a previous occasion, but again, that just doesn't add up. If that's the first time it's ever happened, you've got to be even extra cautious later on. I don't know if they did regularly go overtime, but if it's the first time I've had to come out, and they've had to come out twice in one day, it's like, oh, you've got to be even more careful, man.
expecting was that the radiation detectors were blaring. 7 minutes later, at 9:17 p.m., a health physicist and a fireman donned masks and air tanks and approached the reactor building stairs. Halfway up, the radiation detectors started ticking, and ticking fast. They retreated down the stairs for another detector. Theirs must have been broken, they thought. There was no way radiation levels inside were that high. They returned and found the same worrying readings, but this time they took a look into the reactor room. The operators were nowhere to be found. With enough radiation around them to be dangerously dosing them in minutes, the men again retreated.
Yeah, I was going to say, get the hell out of there.
Emergency crews didn't enter the building for over an hour. The radiation levels were high enough that a plan had to be formulated first. So at
Makes
10:45 p.m., it was decided that only one entry into the building was allowed per person, and that entry was limited to just 60 seconds.
What?
When the first team of 5 men entered the building, they found 2 heavily mutilated men. Burns was dead. McKinley was moaning nearby. Both were soaking wet with irradiated water.
Oh my god, is that a person on the ceiling? Oh my god. Has he just been absolutely blasted up there? That is awful. Oh, man. I mean, again, just looking at that illustration, you see how awful it looks. What?
Both were removed by stretcher and by the same ambulance. 15 minutes later, however, McKinley was dead. 2 of SL-1's 3 operators were accounted for. The third was discovered last because he was barely recognizable. Shaken men reported back at 11:38 p.m. after the latest pass through the destroyed site. They had seen something stuck to the ceiling, a lifeless clump they initially thought was a bundle of rags. It was the body of Richard Legg. Rod number 7 had been launched from the reactor vessel like a rocket and impaled him through his groin and shoulder to the top of the building. While the body of John Burns and Richard McKinley were easily removed, the body of Richard Legg posed a problem. It was pinned by Control Rod 7 directly above the now obliterated reactor core. Emergency crews were worried that Legg's body might fall back into the reactor core during retrieval, and if it was covered in enough radioactive material, or if Control Rod 7 still had enough fuel in it, it might cause the reactor to go critical a second time.
Oh.
So,
What? I was thinking the whole 60-second thing is going to be able to get him out. I just adds more danger, and oh my god.
while the bodies of Burns and McKinley were taken by ambulance to the nearby chemical processing plant, a makeshift hot room for the corpses on the night of January 3rd, it would be almost a week before Legg's body would join theirs. On January 9th, a team of 10 men used sharp hooks on long poles to pull Legg's body free from the control rod piercing it. It dropped onto this stretcher, attached to a crane leaning in from outside the building. The explosion of SL-1 remains the only fatal reactor accident in United States history.
Oh, it seems amazing that they've seemed to have at least learned from a lesson that it hasn't happened again, or people being more careful. You've got to say fair play for learning that, and it's awesome it hasn't happened again. Tragic it has happened, but awesome. We sit here today, hopefully still today, and hopefully for the rest of the future that it hasn't happened again.
At the time of the accident, there was maybe only a single man on Earth who had performed an autopsy on a radioactive corpse. That man was Dr. Clarence Lushbaugh.
Okay.
Almost exactly 2 years before SL-1 exploded, Dr. Lushbaugh had put a man named Cecil Kelly's brain in a mayonnaise jar and sent 8 pounds of his tissues around the country after Kelly died in a criticality accident at Los Alamos National Laboratory.
Oh, wow.
But that's a longer story for another time. Dr. Lushbaugh boarded a military DC-3 in Los Alamos at 2:30 p.m. on January 8, 1961, and arrived in Idaho 4 hours later. Reportedly, officials in Idaho were grateful for his availability. When Lushbaugh and his team arrived, they found 3 bodies waiting for them inside of the decontamination room of the Idaho Chemical Processing Plant, an improvised hot room after SL-1 exploded.
Okay.
The remains of Burns and McKinley were in stainless steel tanks filled with alcohol and ice for preservation, and Legg was still in the lead cask he was placed inside after descending from the ceiling. His body was far too radioactive to be in the open air. To process these bodies, Dr. Lushbaugh's team would have to get creative. Each body was heavily mutilated and so radioactive that it wouldn't be safe to be in the same room with them. According to the actual transcript of Lushbaugh's original autopsy report, quote, "Since bodies emanating such high levels of radioactivity had never been encountered previously, modifications of the usual autopsy procedures and techniques had to be improvised upon the basis of radiologic safety procedures and common sense."
I mean, again, that just shows how dangerous it is, I guess. The fact that the tragic things happened, they've obviously died, which is awful, but the fact that later on, we're past over a week at this point, The doctors come in, they're all there. There's still that danger. The body is still emitting so much radiation. It's dangerous to be in the same room with them. Like, that is mental from an explosion from it. It's like, what? Oh, it's scary, scary stuff today. And then I know it's a lot safer now, and there's a lot more technology and precautions. But then you think there's submarines everywhere going around with these reactors as their engines. Even though it is a lot more safe, and there's a lot of like a lot of fail features in there to stop it obviously exploding. But when you think about it, you think, well, if that hits a rock and it gets a bit unstable, I'm not the biggest expert on it, but surely I could go boom, and that's a bit scary, man, because there's a lot more people on a submarine than the 3 people in there. It's like, yeah, it's a little bit scary. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I may be completely off with that.
Personnel who made these examinations comprised a well-trained team of 5 health physicists, 1 radiobiologist, 1 pathologist, and 2 physicians.
Okay.
End quote. An improvised autopsy table was created from sawhorses and a stainless steel tray. Knives, hooks, and hacksaws were attached onto lengths of galvanized steel pipes by a nearby welding shop. The team wouldn't be able to get anywhere near the bodies with parts of them as radioactive as they were, so Lushbaugh cut them off. Quote, Legg's head, which appeared to be the major source of the prohibitive radiation level, had been damaged by the blast beyond recognition. There could be seen some obvious cervical fractures, which appeared to make feasible the separation of the head from the body. This operation was then carried out with a specially prepared knife, long-handled hook, and wire snare controlled through a 10-foot pipe handle. The remains of the head were placed in a lead cave 20 feet from the cask. End quote. Again, according to the 1968 book Atomic America by Todd Tucker, large chunks of Burns, Legg, and McKinley were, quote, sliced, sawed, and hacked off by Lushbaugh, and then placed in a drum and buried in the Idaho desert as radioactive waste. End quote. Rushed by radiation, each autopsy only took Lushbaugh between 15 and 20 minutes.
I mean, to be fair, that is quite quick to say, he's got drills on the end of pipes. There's a lot of technical. They can't go near him. You know what? He's done good work there. He's gone quite quick.
Dr. Lushbaugh determined the cause of death for each man. Richard McKinley bled out after his hand and the right side of his face was blown off during the explosion. John Burns, quote, died the instant he struck a flat surface that fractured his chest and drove a rib through his heart. And Richard Legg, quote, died instantaneously from the destruction of his viscera by rapidly expanding gases that penetrated his abdominal cavity along with a heavy missile. In examining the bodies, Lushbaugh was able to place the men the instant before SL1 went prompt critical. This answered the question of how, but not the question of why. Why did John Burns remove the rod like he did that night? Was it an accident, a suicide, or something else?
That is the question.
Thankfully, most of the radiation released by the SL1 explosion was contained inside the building. This allowed the General Electric Corporation to remove the reactor vessel and clean the contaminated buildings from 1961 to 1962. On May 21, 1961, GE constructed a burial ground 1,600 feet northeast of the original site of the reactor and sealed 99,000 cubic feet of contaminated material underground.
Wow.
The bodies of McKinley, Burns, and Legg were not returned to their families. They were instead placed in lead-lined caskets inside of metal vaults and covered with concrete.
It is a shame, but I suppose it's understandable. You don't want that radiation getting out. It's obviously so dangerous, but it definitely is a little bit worse as well for a family. Maybe they'll feel they haven't got that closure or something like that because it was never returned, but that's awful, man.
Richard McKinley, John Burns, and Richard Legg had died during America's first nuclear meltdown on a frigid night in rural Idaho. There were no witnesses. Based on the circumstantial evidence, it was either an accident, suicide, or murder. It's not surprising that the story of an unstable John Burns, just off the phone with his now ex-wife who is possibly having an affair with Richard Legg, committing a murder-suicide with a prototype nuclear reactor, is the story that gets retold the most often.
Yeah, it's not surprising.
And you'd be hard-pressed to find any retelling of the story of SL1 that didn't include these details. However, according to the final report, which took almost 2 years to complete and involved literally hundreds of scientists, experts, and engineers from a dozen different research and government entities, no evidence of a love triangle or murder-suicide was ever found. The best explanation, as mock-ups and experiments testing every aspect of that night demonstrated, was that the central control rod number 9 was likely stuck, as it had been stuck many times before, and Burns pulled the rod up too far while attempting to free it.
Okay, that, to be fair, I didn't think about that, but that does make sense. I mean, we've all been there, especially when I come to think of it. I feel like on a golf course, sometimes if you ever play golf and you pull in a flag out, if you get it at the wrong angle, it's not coming out. And then you yank it and it's like, oh, I came out way too far. I just wanted to hold it in. So, and I imagine it applies to a lot of things. You could accidentally stuck. Oh, you know what I mean? I get that. And then you don't really have time to think about it because obviously explosions happen, which is mental. That is another possibility. The suicide one is obviously a massive possibility from what we've heard, which is awful. And the murder one, that's even worse, isn't it? If he's meant to do it for someone else. If he's meant to do it for himself, it technically is murder because he's taking the other two with him as well. But it's like, man, awful.
This wasn't anywhere near as exciting as a jilted lover bent on nuclear revenge, but it was no less damning for the military. The SL-1 reactor was in a terrible state before it exploded. It was literally falling apart and looked after by young men whose total experience could be measured in months. As Todd Tucker asks in Atomic America, quote, "Why would a reactor be designed so perilously close to criticality? Why would procedures actually dictate the manual lifting of that rod? Why was Burns allowed to perform dangerous maintenance with so little supervision?"
Direct cause of the accident clearly appears to have been manual withdrawal of the central control rod blade by one or more of the crew members considerably beyond the limits specified in maintenance procedure. However, there was insufficient evidence to establish the actual reason for such abnormal withdrawal.
The Army's hope for a miniaturized nuclear reactor had died with the men tasked with operating it. Rather than revolutionize power generation in remote areas, the meltdown of SL-1 solidified a safety criterion for all future nuclear reactors built in the United States.
Again, at least they learn from it. I said it before, if a disaster like this is going to happen, make sure you learn from it so it doesn't happen again. And they have. They've got the safety criteria in there now. Again, I'm not fully endorsed in it. I don't know all of it. We will hopefully find out in the next couple of minutes. But if something tragic happens, make sure you learn from it and do everything you can for it not to happen again. And since that day, in America, at least it hasn't happened, which is absolutely awesome.
No reactor after SL-1 would be constructed in a geometry that would allow for just one stuck rod to force it into criticality. 2 decades later, the world would experience the worst nuclear disaster in history.
Oh, is it Chernobyl?
Chernobyl reactor number 4 would melt down and end up contaminating an area that was the size of countries. This meltdown was far worse than anything that ever happened in Idaho, but interestingly, it was also the result of improperly withdrawn control rods, also during the maintenance of a shutdown reactor, and also overseen by a small, unsupervised crew in the middle of the night. When we don't learn from history, it tends to repeat itself.
Like I was just saying, it's a shame that all the other countries hadn't looked at it. The Soviet Union hadn't looked at it and gone, all right, we need to fix this. I hope they have now. Again, I don't know the full story, and maybe we will look into Chernobyl a bit more if you want me to on the channel. But it seems like we've learned our lesson now, but that's awful.
Until next time.
Awful. That is the end of the video. Go and check this channel out. They seem to have a lot of other cool videos as well. The link will be in the description. If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button. Smash that subscribe button if you're new around it. I would seriously appreciate that. And yeah, there we go. America's first and hopefully last nuclear meltdown. Such a shame, obviously, about the tragedy of the 3 people. Absolutely awful. But at least we've learned, like I've said, for the past 5 minutes. I hope you guys have enjoyed. A bit graphic, a bit different to what we normally do, but I've really enjoyed it. So thank you, Arctic, on my Discord for suggesting that one. Let me know in the comments on Discord or on Twitter what else you want me to react to, and I will get around to it. I promise you guys that eventually it will be on my channel. Have a fantastic day, guys, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.